Yeltsin's government unleashed shock therapy, privatization on an industrial scale. Every Russian citizen was handed a voucher worth 10,000 rubles, a symbolic share of the nation's wealth. But symbols don't fill stomachs. Desperate for cash, millions sold their vouchers for next to nothing. Former Soviet bureaucrats and opportunistic insiders scooped up the pieces, rigging auctions and cutting secret loans for shares deals with the government. Overnight, a handful of men became billionaires. The rest watched their rubles turn to dust as inflation devoured their savings. Factories closed, wages vanished. The ruble, once a proud currency, collapsed to worthlessness. By the time Russia defaulted on its debts in 1998, its economy had shrunk more severely than America's during the Great Depression. The country that had once sent cosmonauts into orbit now struggled to keep the lights on. Life expectancy plummeted. Alcoholism, crime, and despair soared. And when Yeltsin ordered troops into Chechnya in 1994, promising to restore order, the war only deepened Russia's wounds. Cities burned, soldiers died by the thousands, and in the end, Moscow retreated in humiliation. By the late 1990s, Russia was a ghost of itself, impoverished, humiliated, and exhausted. Yeltsin, increasingly frail and erratic, had lost the people's trust. Parliament tried to impeach him 3 times for corruption, treason, and betrayal. As the century ended, so too did his reign. On December 31st, 1999, as the world prepared for a new millennium, Yeltsin stepped down. In his place stood a man few outside Russia had ever heard of, a former KGB officer with a measured voice and a promise of stability, Vladimir Putin. At first, Putin was seen as a pragmatist, even by the West. He inherited a broken nation and vowed to restore its pride. Oil prices tripled within 5 years, lifting Russia's GDP and reviving its middle class. For a brief moment, Moscow glimmered again. Behind the scenes, though, Putin moved differently. He reined in the oligarchs who had once ruled unchecked. The most powerful of them, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, head of Yukos Oil, was arrested and stripped of his empire after daring to challenge the Kremlin. The message was unmistakable. Power now flowed one way, upward. By 2003, Russia's economy was humming, but democracy was fading. The media bowed to the state. The opposition crumbled. And though private enterprise expanded, it did so under the watchful eye of the Kremlin. Putin offered order instead of freedom, and the people, weary of chaos, accepted. Then came the West's expansion. In 2004, the European Union welcomed 10 new nations, most of them once under Moscow's shadow. NATO, too, extended its reach, adding 7 former Soviet satellites. To Putin, it looked like encirclement, a betrayal of post-Cold War promises. When protests erupted in Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution, calling for democracy and Western integration, Russia saw not liberation, but infiltration. The battle for Ukraine wasn't just about politics, it was about identity, belonging, and influence. The disputed election that year sparked mass protests across Kiev. Thousands camped in Independence Square, wrapped in orange scarves, demanding new elections. Yushchenko, the Western-backed reformer, faced off against Yanukovych, Moscow's man. When fraud was uncovered and a revote ordered, Yushchenko triumphed, and Putin saw a warning written in orange. The West had reached his doorstep. In 2008, at NATO's Bucharest summit, the message was made explicit. NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for membership. That same year, Russian tanks rolled into Georgia. Within days, the world watched as two breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, slipped out of Georgian control with Moscow's backing. The war was short but decisive. The signal was clear. NATO's advance stops here. 6 years later, history repeated itself. After another uprising in Ukraine ousted the pro-Russian president, Russia annexed Crimea, igniting a crisis that would reshape global politics for the next decade. And by 2022, the nightmare returned in full. The Russian army surged across Ukraine's borders in what the Kremlin called a special operation, but to the rest of the world, it was an invasion, unprovoked, brutal, and tragic. Yet it's worth asking, what if things had gone differently? Because back in 2000, in those early, fragile days of Putin's rule, the idea of Russia joining NATO wasn't a fantasy. It was a conversation, a moment, a road not taken. If the West had opened its doors, if trust had triumphed over fear, would the 21st century have unfolded under a lasting peace, or would the same ghosts of empire and suspicion still have found a way to return? Imagine a world where the unthinkable happened, where the bear of the East didn't prowl at NATO's borders but marched right alongside it. Where the very alliance built to contain the Soviet Union welcomed its heir into the fold. This wasn't fantasy. In our alternate timeline, it became reality in 2001. When President George W. Bush looked at post-Soviet Russia, he didn't see an adversary waiting to rise again. He saw a chance to anchor the region, to neutralize old tensions, and to create a bulwark against a rapidly ascending China. Backed by Washington, NATO members fast-tracked the process. The bureaucratic labyrinth of membership talks was skipped entirely. After all, Russia was already part of the Partnership for Peace. Then came the turning point, the 2001 NATO-Russia agreement signed in Brussels. The ink on that paper symbolized something the 20th century never managed, the end of nearly 100 years of rivalry between Moscow and Washington. For the West, it was a geopolitical jackpot, access to Russia's immense natural resources and military expertise. For Russia, it was salvation, a ticket back into the world economy, to Western capital, technology, and legitimacy. Across Europe, a wave of optimism swept through the media. Propaganda machines on both sides worked overtime to reframe history itself. Russia wasn't the villain anymore. It was part of the family. Films, documentaries, and speeches reminded citizens that it was Russian blood that drowned Napoleon's ambitions and Russian steel that helped crush Hitler's armies. Western outlets celebrated Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky as shared European heritage, while Moscow's news anchors praised American entrepreneurship and the new friendship of civilizations. The old ghosts of the Cold War were buried for now. But history never changes without leaving scars. The Second Chechen War, which in our reality isolated Russia, became instead the first joint NATO-Russian operation. Under the banner of the global war on terror, Western intelligence, logistics, and counterinsurgency training flowed into Russian command centers. NATO drones mapped rebel positions. Western advisors guided operations to minimize civilian casualties, at least officially. Human rights groups objected, but the narrative was clear. Chechnya was not a civil war anymore. It was the front line of the global fight against terrorism. By 2003, the war ended in a decisive Russian victory. Putin stood triumphant, a strongman now framed not as a threat to the West, but as its indispensable ally. His approval ratings soared, his control tightened, and his image as the man who restored Russia's pride was unshakable. Still, power has its own gravity. Though NATO demanded democratic values, its oversight of internal politics was, as always, flexible when interests aligned. Western leaders, too preoccupied with business contracts and security cooperation, looked away as Putin rewired Russia's constitution. Elections became ritual performances. Opposition parties withered. The facade of democracy held, but the stage was his alone. The West preferred not to ask difficult questions. Why ruin a strategic miracle? Meanwhile, a familiar storm brewed in Ukraine. The problem, as always, was the past and the borders left behind by the Soviet Union. Crimea, transferred to Ukraine in 1954 as a symbolic gesture by Khrushchev, remained overwhelmingly Russian in identity. When Ukraine's fragile post-Soviet economy collapsed, so did Crimea's patience. By the early 2000s, Moscow's influence lingered like a ghost in language, culture, and loyalty. In 2004, the Orange Revolution still erupted, but it looked different in this world. With fewer Western NGOs funneling funds and a more cautious Washington respecting its NATO partner, the protests were smaller, angrier, and quicker to violence. Across the ethnic Russian East, counter-demonstrations exploded, waving tricolors, demanding reunification with the motherland. Publicly, Moscow urged peace and restraint, citing its NATO commitments. Privately, Russian operatives fanned the flames, financing pro-Moscow rallies and exaggerating claims of discrimination. Within months, the crisis forced NATO into an uncomfortable spotlight. Emergency talks convened in Brussels. Russian diplomats argued that Ukrainian nationalism threatened regional security. Poland and the Baltic states laughed the claim off as absurd. How could Ukraine possibly threaten Russia? They asked. But the older powers, Germany, France, Belgium, hesitated. They wanted stability and cheap energy more than moral clarity. What followed was diplomacy at its most cynical. The Brussels Accord. Ukraine would remain intact, but the protest-ridden regions were reorganized into the Autonomous Republic of Novaria, a compromise modeled after Bosnia's Republika Srpska. Within Ukraine, yes, but with sweeping self-rule, control over local education, language, and trade. Novaria's people could hold dual citizenship with Russia, and joint infrastructure projects like the Kerch Bridge bound them economically to Moscow. In exchange, Russia promised non-interference, at least on paper, and NATO gained a breathing space between East and West. Billions in European investment poured into Ukraine's economy as a gesture of unity. There was, however, one unspoken clause. Ukraine could not apply for EU membership for 20 years. All future elections would be overseen by the OSCE to ensure neutrality, another word for supervision. Across the Atlantic, President Bush was furious. The Brussels talks had unfolded behind Washington's back. European leaders, many still bitter about the US invasion of Iraq, had negotiated with Moscow independently, hinting that the continent no longer needed to dance to Washington's tune. Faced with reality, the US compromised. Russia offered limited air support in Afghanistan, giving the Bush administration a way to save face. The Brussels Accord was signed, televised, and hailed as a triumph of diplomacy. The crowds in Kyiv dispersed. The orange flags came down. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed the impossible had been achieved. NATO and Russia, together, keeping the peace. But beneath the polished speeches and press photos, something darker simmered. Russia had joined the West, but had the West joined Russia? Unlike Poland, which sprinted toward the European Union in 2004, Russia took a different path. Brussels demanded reforms that cut too deep. Strict anti-corruption laws, environmental regulations, and fiscal rules that clashed with Russia's industrial backbone. To Putin, these were shackles, not standards. NATO membership gave him everything he needed: global legitimacy, military prestige, and a seat among the great powers. The EU's rules could wait. Instead of following Europe's model, Russia invited Europe into its own. Western capital flooded eastward. German giants such as Siemens, Volkswagen, BASF, and Deutsche Bank expanded across the Russian frontier, rebuilding highways, electrifying grids, and turning the once Soviet skyline into something out of Dusseldorf or Lyon. French conglomerates like Total Energies and Renault took root in oil, transport, and luxury goods. British and Dutch firms, BP, Shell, Unilever, drove deep into Russia's consumer markets, while Italian groups such as Fiat and Eni joined massive joint ventures in the Urals and Siberia. For a brief, dazzling decade, Moscow became the new Berlin. Glass towers rose where Stalinist blocks had crumbled. Cafes filled with the hum of foreign languages. Western investors called it the Russian miracle. But under the neon lights, corruption never vanished. It simply changed address. Local governors siphoned budgets, bureaucrats demanded bribes, and oligarchs still moved unseen money through Cyprus and Luxembourg. Putin understood that chaos could not be stamped out. It could only be organized. His solution was simple and ruthless: nationalize corruption. The old robber barons were paraded in handcuffs, their empires divided among loyalists of the ruling United Russia Party. A new elite was born, technocrats with Western suits and Eastern loyalties. They sat on the boards of Siemens or BP by day, and at night attended Kremlin briefings. Corruption became a state industry, efficient, predictable, and loyal. The effect was astonishing. Russia's economy, once the wounded relic of the Soviet past, began to mirror Japan's post-war boom, only grander, richer in resources, and free of foreign occupation. By 2008, GDP had soared past $2 trillion, and the ruble was the pride of Eastern Europe. Ordinary Russians, the shopkeepers, teachers, factory workers, finally tasted stability. For the first time in generations, people spoke of the future with hope. Then came the succession. Constitutionally barred from a third term, Putin stepped aside, handing the presidency to his protege, a lawyer from St. Petersburg with an easy smile and fluent English, Dmitry Medvedev. Western journalists adored him. He was young, urbane, and spoke the language of technology and reform. Putin, of course, never truly left. He moved to the prime minister's office, ensuring that the machinery of power remained his to command. At the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, Medvedev made his mark. When talk turned to inviting Georgia and Ukraine into the alliance, he quietly killed the proposal. "There is no enemy left," he reminded the room. "Why build new walls when we've just torn them down?" The delegates applauded. Expansion was over. The age of balance had begun. Under the new tandem leadership, Russia's ascent continued. GDP climbed to $3.3 trillion by 2010. Average income reached $13,800, a figure that would have seemed absurd in the 1990s. Russians celebrated their leaders like saints, their portraits hanging beside icons in village homes. Yet NATO itself was changing. U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld called it the split between Old Europe and New Europe. Old Europe, France, Germany, and Russia preached restraint, diplomacy, and soft power. New Europe, the US, UK, and Poland urged preemption and strength. To Washington, Moscow's growing intimacy with Berlin and Paris was unsettling. America's influence was slipping, replaced by a continent that no longer looked west for leadership. And when Russia vetoed further NATO expansion, blocking Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, and the Baltic states, most of Europe quietly agreed. Why expand against an enemy who no longer exists? NATO turned outward. China and Iran became the new specters on the horizon. 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council were now NATO allies. Only Beijing stood apart, watching the world unite without it. Medvedev sensed the moment. With his polished demeanor and Silicon Valley rhetoric, he became the darling of the Western press. Partnering with Merkel, Belgium, and Norway, he championed a new cause: nuclear disarmament. "Atomic weapons are relics," he declared at Davos. "Fear should not be humanity's compass." France objected. Its arsenal was the ultimate insurance of independence. But Obama, newly in the White House, saw an opportunity for diplomacy. In 2011, alongside Medvedev and Merkel, he signed the New START Treaty, reducing Europe's warheads by half and allowing NATO nations to declare themselves nuclear-free zones. A minimal shared deterrent remained under alliance control, the sword in the stone of the modern age. In America, the backlash was swift. Republicans accused Obama of selling out to Moscow. At one debate, Mitt Romney warned, "Russia is our greatest geopolitical threat." Obama smiled and delivered the line that defined the decade. Governor Romney, the 1980s called, "They want their foreign policy back." The audience roared. The Cold War was now a punchline. But east of the Urals, China was watching and preparing. Under Xi Jinping, defense spending soared to 18% of GDP. The PLA poured billions into cyber warfare, hypersonic missiles, and blue water fleets. The Belt and Road Initiative slowed as funds were redirected to the military. Purges swept the Communist Party. Alleged NATO sympathizers vanished overnight. Propaganda thundered. The imperialists are at the gate. By 2015, the balance cracked. To contain Beijing, President Obama unveiled the Pacific Treaty Organization, a 21st century resurrection of CETO. Its founding members, the US, UK, Russia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, and New Zealand, formed a new ring around the Pacific. This time, the alliance had teeth: 50,000 troops on rotation, joint fleets in the Taiwan Strait, and economic councils coordinating sanctions and trade diversification. China denounced it as the new 8-nation alliance, recalling the humiliation of the Boxer Rebellion. But the protest changed nothing. Under sanctions and cyber siege, Beijing's export economy shrank, North Korea clung tighter, Iran, isolated, saw its oil market collapse. Then came the spark that turned the balance of power upside down. In 2018, President Donald Trump recognized Taiwan as a sovereign state and welcomed it into the PTO. China blustered but could not act. Its navy stayed in port. Its diplomats raged at the UN. Some Western hawks whispered of giving Taiwan China's Security Council seat, but even this bold new world wasn't ready for that gamble. By the early 2020s, the planet no longer revolved around Washington. 2 vast alliances ruled it: NATO in Europe and PTO in the Pacific, each sharing power, economy, and purpose. And standing at the center of both was Russia, wealthy, confident, indispensable. The empire that once fell in silence had returned through partnership, not conquest. For the first time in modern history, global dominance was not purely American. It was shared, a fragile, glittering balance historians would later call the Pax Russica.